Each day, just before dawn, countless Hindus rise and take a bath. Most live in India, but they also are in places as distant as Singapore and Washington, D.C. Their early morning bath cleanses not only their bodies, but their spirits as well. Many more Hindus proceed with a ritual known as a puja. This is an act of worship during which they burn incense and make offerings of flowers, fruits, milk or sweets to a statue or a picture of one among the hundreds of Hindu gods, goddesses or spirits. Some may undertake the system of exercise known as yoga. They practice breath control, sitting for hours in the so-called lotus position. Hinduism embraces a wide variety of beliefs and practices. Indeed, some Hindu doctrines and practices seem almost to contradict one another, as the very old mixes with the very new. The Sanskrit word Veda most generally means truth or knowledge, and it is related to the English word wit. But the word Veda is most often used specifically to refer to ancient Hindu scriptures. The earliest portions of the Vedic library are organized into 4 separate collections of verse called Samhitas. The Rig Samhita alone contains over 1,000 separate hymns, with more than 10,000 verses divided into 10 books. According to the Hindu belief, inspired sages, known as rishis, heard these verses directly from the gods. Each of these religious poems usually addresses one of the Vedic gods or goddesses or spirits, each of whom represents natural forces such as the sun, the moon, and the wind. The god mentioned most often is Indra, who resembles Zeus of Greek mythology. Many poems in the Rig Samhita honor Indra's majesty and power.
I praise the most heroic Indra, whose mighty work separated the earth from the sky. Indra drives the sun like a swift chariot to bring him here to his worshippers. Like a river, he is always active and never rests. He destroys the darkness with light.
In ancient Hindu worship and sacrifice, the 1,028 hymns of the Rig Veda were chanted during religious ceremonies. Some of those verses are still recited at weddings, funerals, and initiation rites. Just the act of reciting them is sacred, and their very sound is holy. Modern scholars don't know all the details of the religious rituals practiced during the Vedic age, but they do know that poetry from the Rig Samhita was chanted as part of several highly complicated rites. These rituals could take weeks, months, or even a year to perform. They also required the presence of many priests, each specializing in some part of the ceremony. During the Vedic age, the most specialized devotional activity was the soma ritual. Soma was a liquid produced by crushing some form of vegetation. Priests collected the plant as they sang hymns about searching for and cutting down the soma plant. The Brahmanas, which were composed somewhere between the years 1000 and 800 BCE, adopt almost a shrill tone in defending both the importance of rituals and the practice of giving many gifts to the priests who perform them. Indeed, many of the Upanishads, the last 300 or so books of the Vedic library, were berating a Vedic religious system that would soon die out and be replaced. In fact, the earliest Vedic texts never mention the belief and practices that a modern person usually associates with Hinduism. The Samhitas indicated that ancient Indians ate beef, but over the centuries the cow became a sacred animal, a symbol of the earth's fertility. Eating beef became a sin. The first Vedas described an afterlife, Later, the Upanishads introduced a different idea: reincarnation. Hindus thus came to believe that unenlightened souls are trapped in a continuous cycle of birth and death. Moksha, freedom from the painful cycle of rebirth and redeath, became the goal of those who focused their efforts on meditation and self-discipline. Vedic beliefs and practices probably were eclipsed by religious revolts against the dominance of priests and their elaborate rituals. The religious traditions of Jainism and Buddhism, which both had begun in the 6th century BCE, would become the most famous of these protest movements.
Buddhism and Jainism was in part, at this time period, a reaction against the caste system. The caste system is comprised of 4 levels, which is the Brahmins, which are the priests, the Kshatriyas, which are the warriors, the Vaishyas, which are the laborers, and the Shudras, which are the untouchables. Now, these castes were strict, and you could not pass easily between castes. If you were a woman, you could pass, but through marriage. But if you were a male, you were stuck to your caste. You were born into a caste, and you had to follow the behavior of that caste. Brahmins were in charge of these rituals, and if not Brahmins, then the higher castes were in charge of these rituals. So this ritual obsession created large segments of the population that were alienated, totally alienated from any spirituality, religious belief, because they couldn't really partake in these rituals. They might be able to employ a Brahmin to do these rituals, but they really weren't partaking in the rituals themselves. They were alienated from them. So this is one reason why Buddhism and Jainism developed. It was a reaction against this caste and ritual extremism.
Philosophical and ethical doctrines of the Jains and Buddhists changed the character of Hinduism. The Vedic rituals gradually faded into the background after the 6th century BCE, and a new era in the development of Hinduism began. In 326 BCE, the troops of Alexander the Great crossed the Indus River in northwest India. For some time, it had been apparent that an attack was coming, and the rulers of various Indian territories already had banded together. This created what would become known as the Mauryan Empire. As it turned out, Alexander's soldiers refused to go any farther than the Indus River. But Indian politics already had changed. In about 250 BCE, Ashoka became emperor of the Mauryan dynasty. He expanded the empire through fierce wars of conquest, during which hundreds of thousands died. Ashoka sickened of the bloodshed and turned to the Buddhist faiths for consolation. He dramatically influenced Indian religious life by offering patronage to Buddhists.